In their excellent new piece for the Chronicle of Higher Education, our next guests look at the role Ivy League schools play in American society, writing, quote, "These institutions set and sanction the boundaries of knowledge, including what kinds of political and social views are welcomed in prestige cultural spaces."
Matt Stoller, Research Director at the American Economic Liberties Project, and historian Sam Haselby join us now to discuss. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
So, Matt, can you lay out for us a little bit the argument that you're making in this article?
Yeah, so it's that Ivy League schools play a special role in American society, and they have always, going back to the founding, been bastions of elitism. The kind of counterpoint is a broad set of more democratic institutions, which are state schools and schools that are spread out among the country. And those are undergoing a dramatic collapse at this moment. And so you are seeing a kind of winner-take-all dynamic in the higher education space. And this is a fundamental threat to our democracy, because who produces knowledge and wisdom in a society is fundamentally a political question.
So, Sam, there would be two, I guess, counterpoints here where people would say, well, so what, right? Like, these things are sort of isolated to the ivory towers. What's the big deal if we have people trying to fix things like systemic racism and misogyny in academic circles where these discussions have been contained for years and years? Is something different happening now with a trickle effect into our institutions, or a trickle down, you could say, or a ripple effect into our institutions more broadly? Is something happening now that wasn't happening in the past?
That's a great question, and that's one of the points of the article. Yes, exactly. I mean, people are very familiar with the extraordinary accumulation of wealth and resources by individuals and corporations. We hear a lot about Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. We hear a lot about how rich the banks are. We hear a lot about how rich the Waltons and Walmart are. But what gets less attention is that the same vast accumulation and increasing accumulation of wealth and power has happened at the Ivy League schools to a scale that is really unprecedented. So when you combine that with some of their historical qualities about exclusion and meritocracy, it creates a new kind of problem.
And Matt, what can we do about this? I mean, my ideas aren't ever serious or realistic. I would just have all of these schools seized and turned into state schools or public schools. That's unlikely to garner enough support to get through a system that is, held in a chokehold by graduates of those institutions. What can be done?
Well, I think there's basically two approaches, one that the right will like and one that the left will like, and the others will hate, vice versa. The first is tax the endowments of these schools. These schools have massive accumulations of wealth. They are basically hedge funds attached, with a side hustle of being educational institutions.
J.D. Vance said that recently, too. He's a Republican running for Senate in Ohio. J.D. Vance said the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a well-known, and Tom Cotton proposed actually taxing these endowments. I mean, and you should do that because these schools do get bailouts, right? They get bailouts like any Wall Street hedge fund. They needed them in 2008 and 2020. So tax those endowments. Actually, Trump started to tax the endowments a little bit. So you started seeing some of that. There are some state law proposals in Massachusetts from Democrats, but Tom Cotton proposed it recently. But the other thing that you got to do is you got to start funding this broad mass of more democratic schools. You got to there's been this kind of starvation diet and austerity from state schools and smaller schools and community colleges that really educate the broad mass of the public. And you have to stop that bleeding and rebuild that intellectual muscle memory in America. And that, Pramila Jayapal and Bernie Sanders and sort of the left want to restore funding to those academic institutions who are kind of the competitors, the ideological and intellectual competitors to the Ivy League.
So, Sam, I'm also curious about the ideology itself that has sort of formed or maybe radicalized in academic circles. I think that's a function of groupthink. As you continue to sort of make dissent less and less easy, you get, stronger sense of groupthink, and that congeals into something that's sort of a bad intellectual product. I mentioned earlier on the show this week an article now in Jacobin, an essay that's out in Jacobin, about how our ruling class, the people who go through Ivy League institutions in the way that the WASPs of yore used to go through the institutions. Right. There's a different mentality. There's a different ideology, actually, and that's not to pine for the ideology of yore that the WASPs used to foist upon the rest of us. But can you speak to maybe how that itself has shifted in recent years and what effect that has on the phenomenon you discussed in this article?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you for asking. That's very simple. I mean, as these institutions grow vastly and vastly richer, look, one of the ways that elite institutions in a liberal society legitimate themselves is by including dissenters and critics, right? And as these institutions grow richer and richer and richer and richer to scales beyond previously imagined, the pressure to do that for some people who have really sincere progressive beliefs in these institutions becomes greater and greater and greater. But I think there's two basic historical points that also I'd like to make. One is just that the Reconstruction, the creation of national citizenship, and Reconstruction and the modern civil rights movement are really the greatest achievements in modern American democracy. And both of them were high water marks for public education in the United States. Reconstruction created the land-grant universities in the United States, the great land-grant universities, the University of Wisconsin, et cetera, et cetera. These have always been, and at the greatest times of American democracy, real competitors to the Ivy League schools. Because in a way, this isn't an anti-Ivy League piece. I mean, our point is really about public education and the need for public education in any democracy. And the second point is simply that I think there's a bias for intellectuals and for people when they talk about meritocracy to think of it in a very literal or lexical way, to think of what the word merit means and to start thinking about, merit means good and good is good and we want to have more good. And very quickly the discussion goes towards Plato and Emerson, and that's all great, and I'm as prone to that as anybody. But it's also important to understand that meritocracy is a system. It's not just an idea of good people or capable people ruling. And if you want to understand meritocracy, the best way is not to talk too much about abstract notions of good, but to look at this system of elite exclusive private education and how it works. And in that sense, the one, I think, really clear and dramatic example is that this has been in the news recently, so I'll mention it because a lot of people are talking about this, obviously, is that Phillips Exeter Academy, a private high school, has an endowment of basically the same amount of money as the University of California, Davis. So that's meritocracy. So if you want to think about what meritocracy is, it's not just this idea of being good or capable and those people being in charge. It's the system of institutions and how they work.
Right, which makes it so hard to compete, as you talked about. I want to pick up on what both Matt and you said about competing with public schools and also some other private schools. So I moved up with my family to Vermont for this pandemic, and going around the state, I noticed that several private universities that they're not scam universities, they're not. It's not grift university. It's not like Phoenix Online or whatever. Normal schools were going under, and combining that with what you were talking about of the decimation of state schools. In your research for this article, what did you find about the state of these kind of middle tier, smaller private colleges?
Is that a question for me or Matt?
Either one, but Sam.
Well, this is my research. A lot of people have researched this and know more about this than I do. But it's just what has happened in the last generation more generally, and the pandemic has accelerated it, is the collapse of this great post-war bargain that was, of course, the sort of height of American prosperity, the post-war boomer years, where all of these social provisions and social goods and public goods were available to people. I mean, this has just collapsed. Look at the difference between the GI Bill, for example, and student debt. They're like the opposite thing. The GI Bill sent a generation of people to school and set them on a path to a middle-class life. The student lending system and the student debt system, indentures people to quasi-peonage for decades just for going now even to public schools because they've become so expensive.
So, Matt, before we run, we wanted to get your thoughts on something you actually wrote recently about Amazon Prime. Ryan has the article right in front of him.
Right. So you wrote about how Amazon Prime is now getting now getting sued over its price hiking. Can you explain quickly what people would say? Hey, Amazon Prime, hey, that's free shipping, free this, free that. How can that be a price problem? What's wrong with that?
Right. Amazon Prime, it always seemed like kind of too good to be true. And as it turns out, it is. So just to be really brief, what effectively happens is Amazon bakes the price of shipping into the consumer price. So if something would cost $5, people don't like paying for shipping. So when they see free shipping, they're excited about it. So if something costs $5 and the shipping would cost $4, Amazon just says, okay, to its third-party merchants who are selling it, you have to sell this for $9 and to Prime members, which is basically everyone at this point. And then you don't have to say then they could just say it's free shipping. It's of course not free shipping. It's just a higher consumer price, and they bake the shipping into the price itself. Now, what they're being sued for is they're so powerful that they've been signing agreements with retailers or with all of their suppliers and their third-party merchants that say, or forcing agreements on them effectively, that say you can't charge that lower, say, $5 price anywhere else. So if you want to sell it directly and sell it cheaper, you want to sell it offline through, say, our normal retailer, you actually have to charge the $9 price. So what's happening is everyone thinks on Amazon Prime they're getting the lowest price, but that's only because Amazon has so much power that they've actually forced the rest of the economy to raise their prices to the Prime level so that they could continue to say, oh, look, free shipping.
Well, the common thread here between both of these topics is cronyism. And we thank you both for joining us and offering, I think, really helpful historic perspective. And you can get more historic perspective on all of these issues. First of all, you can read the piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and you can read Matt's book, Goliath, which is right behind him now. Thank you both for taking the time to help us work through these issues today.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Thanks a lot.
We really appreciate it, and we will be back with more Rising right after this.